So I just got a text from my mom wishing us a happy anniversary, which is really cool. But it's like I kind of have something going on right now. So maybe she'll understand that I don't text back immediately. So we've started going through 1 Peter and going through the letters of Peter, and and again, I try to be fairly transparent. I started going through 1 Peter, and kind of you realize, okay, this is where we're going to go. We're going to go through this book, and you read through things, but then you read things differently whenever you're going to start sharing them, right? And you realize, 1 Peter starts hitting on some topics that I don't know if I want to talk about, because they're not easy to talk about. They can get you in trouble, right? It's kind of like when we started going through Ecclesiastes. It's like, whew, this is tough stuff. Maybe we need to change gears. But the bad thing is sometimes, you're like, well, I kind of locked myself in. I said we're going to have a series on 1 Peter, so I have to hit it all. So we're going to. So I want to prepare you now. This is a tame one today. But 1 Peter moves into some pretty sensitive topics, but very relevant for us today. And so I'm really excited about it. But that's why it is so important. That's why it's so important to understand context and to understand where, like, a letter in the Bible is going. If you just pick 2 or 3 verses and just talk about them out of context, you can really mess things up, right? And I think in the negative things that we've done in Christianity and in the church, it usually comes back to that. Taking like one verse, taking a truth within that, but not applying it to context, and moving forward and plowing people over based on one thought that may not be actually accurate, right? And so that we're going to see some of that in 1 Peter, and so today is kind of, again, moving up and establishing this context. So we've talked about how Peter is writing to a group of Christians who are probably mixed between Jews and Gentiles, right? There's no doubt, because this letter went to a lot of different churches. He talks about that there is persecution, that they're living among those who don't believe as they do. Some of the people would have been experiencing different levels of persecution. More than likely, this wasn't written to people who were undergoing extreme persecution. Like they weren't being beheaded at this time for their faith, or they weren't being thrown into, to fight the lions with the gladiators, right? That would come. Don't worry, that would come. But at this point, that's not what's going on. It's more, there's probably strife within families, strife within doing business. People are starting, the main religions of the day would have been looking down on them and doing things to oppress. So it was, in a lot of ways, probably more similar to oppression that we would experience. That's not true persecution as far as your life is in danger, but yet real challenges and things that would sometimes make you wonder, should I just walk away from all this? Is it worth standing up and holding this belief when this is what it's going to do for me, right? And so that's what's going on. He starts off, if you remember in the first chapter, starts talking about a living hope, right? This hope that's looking for the future, but it's a future hope that impacts the present. So we have this living hope in Christ. And then we move to this idea of maturing. Remember, he says you should love everyone, which is great. We all can agree with that. But then he also says, and your behavior needs to change, because you need to be holy as Christ is holy, right? And that's where we don't really like it, right? We just want to love everybody. We don't want to actually acknowledge that there are certain behaviors that people need to change and that we need to change, right? And part of maturing is being able to do both of those at the same time, right? That you can say, I love you, and believe that and want what's best for someone, and also tell them, you know what, this is probably an area in your life that you need to start working on, right? We don't like that. Society doesn't like that, right? And that's part because we're in an immature society, right? And so part of what Peter is saying is you've got to mature, you've got to grow up. And the hard part about this is you could mature and start being able to have a better perspective on things, but you're still living in a society that is immature. And so you're going to be as backwards, even though you're the one that's maturing. Right? It's this interesting dynamics that's going on here. So all of this is very important. So Peter is laying all of this out. And we get to chapter 2, and I want to hit this passage. Chapter 2 in 1 Peter, starting in verse 4. So going verse 4 through 10. It says, as you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For in Scripture it says, see, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the ones who trust in him will never be put to shame. Now to you who believe, this stone is precious, but to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into this wonderful light. Once you were a people, but now you are a people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. All right. So 4th of July is coming up. One thing that you're going to notice is you're going to notice a lot of flags, right? They're going to be everywhere. And it's interesting, whenever you think about a flag, why do we fly a flag, right? It's because it represents something, right? It reminds us of something. And it can become very, very important. It evokes a whole lot of emotion, right? We've seen that over and this is not a new problem, right? But burning the flag, things like that. Why is that such a massive protest that hits people? Because there's this emotional connection. And yeah, some of it is a little irrational, right? It's just a flag. But yet there's something about symbols like that touch us to the core, right? I've always, have you ever noticed on a soldier's uniform, they'll always have the flag. And to me, it looks backwards, right? Does it look like that to you? If the next time you see it, think about it. It's like, wait, that's flying the wrong way. And now I don't know if this is true because it's coming from Tim. So but it does make sense. But I did not check another source. But no, the reason it makes perfect sense because and I've always been fascinated by this. If you look at pictures of battle back years and years ago, what was one of the first things that went into battle? Someone carrying a flag, right? I mean, let's think about it on a rational level. How stupid, right? You have people firing guns at you, and you decide to use one of your commodities, a person, right? Rather than him shooting back, he's carrying a flag, right? That on a rational level does not make sense, right? But it shows the power of that because what the whole reason behind that is you need to be reminded what you were rallying around. So as your comrades are getting shot, you can still see that's what we're fighting for, right? That's it in a nutshell. And so the reason that the little badge of the American flag looks backwards is because if that soldier is running to battle, how would that flag be going? It would be going that way, right? So it's actually leading into battle. That's why it flies that way. Is that correct, Tim? All right. So, which again, then starts making sense. And so we have this interesting dynamic where a flag becomes something more, right? Because it's representing something more, right? Now, that's just to show how symbols can really make an impact. How they remind us, and at their best, they remind us of something good, right? Anything can be twisted, we understand that, but at their best, that's what it does. This passage, talking about some imagery that would be very powerful to the people. The word stone or rock is used like 9 times in these few verses, right? That is language that would immediately people would recall the temple and the importance of the temple, right? The temple on this rock, the temple will be built. This is language that's what it is talking about. And it's obviously making the case now that, listen, the temple is wonderful, but now Christ is the cornerstone, and now you are living stones. But there is a strong connection, and you need to understand the connection between the symbolism of the temple, of how important that was, to understand how important what Peter is saying right here is. Because he's saying you are living stones now, right? You think, oh, okay, what does that mean? Am I supposed to be strong? Am I supposed to be secure? Am I supposed to be hard? Am I supposed to be, what does that mean? What does it mean being a living stone? It's important to know that what it's doing is it's a connection back to the temple. So let's think about the temple. The temple started off as the tabernacle, right? In the Old Testament, you can read through. It's amazing, some places in the Old Testament where it talks about how the tabernacle is to be constructed, right? And then it'll later talk about how the temple should be constructed. And they're both very similar. And it's very detailed. And I always kind of, as a kid, I remember hearing the term temple, and I kind of thought, oh, that's just a really cool sanctuary that probably has like a dome or something, right? But I saw it as this was a place that people would come and they would sit and they would worship and stuff like that. That's not what the temple was. The temple was not an auditorium. It didn't have seats. That's not where people went every week to go worship, right? That's not what it was. It was something very different, right? And it basically had 3 sections. It had an outer section that just about anyone could come into, right? And then it had 2 sections on the inside, right? It had one where basically the religious leaders could go, and then it had a place that was called the Holy of Holies. And in that original tabernacle, there was an altar, and there was the Ark of the Covenant that was sitting there, and it was divided from that room to the other room where the religious leaders could go, divided by a veil, right? And you were not to go into the Holy of Holies. What was interesting is there were lots of religious ceremonies and things that went into this, but people would come to the temple for the purpose of offering sacrifices that would be then given to God, right? So at its core, I kind of started thinking, okay, what would the temple really represent? And that's kind of a hard question, right? Because going back to our previous example, if I said, what does this flag represent? There's kind of, everyone's going to have different ideas on that, right? Some are going to have really positive ideas. Some are going to have very negative ideas. Well, guess what? The temple kind of would do that too, right? But so how do you sum that up? How do you sum up what the temple was about? And I think whenever I really started thinking about it, to me, what the temple was conveying was, one, holiness. You see that throughout the describing the tabernacle and the temple. The Holy of Holies, right? That was the center, was the Holy of Holies. The purpose of the temple was for people to come and to offer sacrifices for the forgiveness of their sins. The Jewish people still have the Day of Atonement, right? Because why? Because we're trying to be holy as He is holy. And we can't do that whenever we're still living in sin. And so would go to the temple to try to become holy, right? And so whenever you think of the temple, you think of holiness, of striving to live the life that God has created all of us to live. But the temple also represented the very real presence of God. Now, we are in a culture, and I'm finding myself, man, I just keep getting old. You know how everybody does that, right? But you remember things that your parents said whenever you were a kid, and you're like, oh, that's so old. I'll never do that. And now I'm doing the same thing. So when I say this, I recognize I'm kind of like that old person sitting on my porch saying, get off my lawn. But one thing that has happened in our language is that people use the term literally all the time, right? And it's never literally. And you're like, what? We have just completely removed the meaning of a word. It's like, literally, I was scared to death. No, you're talking to me. You were not scared to death, right? That is not true, right? So whenever I say this, I'm using the term literally, but it's a little dicey. But the people actually did believe this at the time, that the temple was literally the presence of God on earth, right? They believed that 100%, right? That is where he was on earth. That was kind of the touching point from heaven to earth. So the temple represented the presence of God. And as the Israelites were wandering the desert for 40 years, when they would wander, they would pack up the tabernacle, and it would go first, and they would set it up first. Why? Because God was going ahead of them, right? And then when the temple eventually was built in Jerusalem with King Solomon, it represented God's literal presence in the world. Now, part of that was a little bit of a misunderstanding, right? And because it started to become where the temple became more than what it should have been, right? But what it did is it no doubt represented God's presence here in the world. So those are two things whenever I think about the temple that really jump out to me. One is holiness, this desire to understand that we need to be better. We need to live more like God created us to live. And two, the presence of God in the world. That's what it represented. And so now, with that backdrop, what does Peter say? He says, you are to be living stones, that you are forming a spiritual house. You are now part of the temple, if you will. But it's a different type of temple. It's a temple with someone different at the cornerstone, right? So we're moving. This is a move from Old Testament thinking to New Testament thinking with the revelation of Jesus Christ, right? And so this old idea of what the temple was, it's actually kind of been torn down, and very literally, soon after these letters were written, the temple would be literally torn down, right? So it would no longer exist. What Peter is saying is, yeah, the temple may not exist, but what the temple represents still does, because that is built on the cornerstone of Jesus Christ, right? And he talks about the stone that the builders rejected, right? He's talking about the Jewish people at that time. That, he's making the case that, hey, God sent you this stone that was supposed to be part of this temple, right? And you've rejected it. I see that in a whole different way. They've been putting up rock on our house, and it's amazing to watch people that know how to do it, right? Because they have spaces, and they look, and they go like this, and then they'll take a rock, and then they'll, boom, just make it break, and so that rock fits where it's supposed to go. Well, there's a whole lot of rocks now that are piled up, and I told them, I'll keep them, so now they're just going to stay in a pile for the next 18 years of my marriage. They're going to be in a pile, right? But they were all rejected. The builder rejected them, right? They were options. They could have been used, but it doesn't fit, doesn't look right. We just don't need that. That's who Christ was. The people, they rejected him, just as many reject him today. Throw him off in the cast heap. Throw him off with all those other religions, all those other wise people, all those other good teachers. We'll just throw him off over there, right? But no, he is actually the cornerstone. And so God has taken him from there. He's made him into the cornerstone, and now he's rebuilding this idea of the temple around Jesus, of which we are living stones. In a sense, we're part of the temple, right? So our role is very similar. What should we be doing? We should be living holy lives, right? At the very end of this, he says, you are a chosen priesthood, a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into the wonderful light, right? That we are now realize, no, we need to live a different way. No longer do we live in darkness. We need to start living in the light. We need to start living holy lives, right? And at the same time, we are proclaiming the presence of God all around us, right? He says, you have, at one point you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. That should make us live differently, right? We actually are examples, and we point people to the reality of God. Now that's, you can take that too far, right? We need to be really humble in this. But listen, God is calling you to reveal his presence to the world around you. Because guess what? Most people are not coming into here to experience God's presence. They're not doing it. So how's the only way they're going to experience, or one of the only ways that they're going to experience God's presence? It's through you. It's through us. It's through the way that we are interacting in the world. That's what the temple was supposed to be doing, right? The temple was a representation of God's presence in the world, and it was supposed to flow out from that. The bad thing that happened is, as people do, is it became the focus. The temple itself became the focus. No, that's not it. We are part of a spiritual temple that is going out into the world around us, proclaiming the holiness of God and the presence of God. And it is an amazing statement. And it would have been amazing for the people reading this whenever Peter said, you are living stones, part of a spiritual house being built with Jesus Christ as the cornerstone. That is a high calling. That is a wonderful opportunity. And that's how the world has changed. That's why the world was changed. It's because they realized we are the new temple. We're part of it. We are the living stones. I encourage you to live your life as a living stone that you are, right? And it all sits on the foundation of Jesus, the one who has been rejected, but who, as God, has made the cornerstone. He's the cornerstone of your life. He's the cornerstone of the temple. He's the cornerstone that gives us the opportunity to be living stones in the world around us. Let's go to him in prayer.